Markov went from the hollow file to hollow file looking for some good news. So far nothing. So far the marker had remained unresponsive and mute. They had tried everything they could to think of. They had begun to experiment on it. A team of cryptologists was attempting to decipher the symbols on the marker, but without any idea of what the symbols referred to, they weren't making any progress. They had subjected it to an electric current without result. They had tried irradiating it, subjecting it to radio waves, microwave, electromagnetic waves. Nothing, always nothing, all or almost nothing. The marker, the researchers had told him, had begun to broadcast again, very slight now, but definitely present. Some of the scientists working on the marker seemed to notice it, others did not. According to Stevens, those who noticed had begun to be visited by dead relatives, just as Altman had been in the Baskif, all with some variation of the same message. Leave the marker alone. Do not try to make use of it. The scientists themselves didn't understand it any better than he did, and after conveying the message to Stevens, they had started speculating about it among themselves. It was a warning. Some felt and should be taken at face value. Nobody should touch the marker. Nobody should try to harness its technology. If they did, they would unleash something they couldn't imagine. But maybe it was simply that they weren't ready. Others felt that once they proved themselves worthy, the secrets of the marker would be revealed to them. There were many more in the latter camp. A mystical belief in the marker had started to grow. Whenever they could, the believers gathered together and worked themselves up, convinced as they were that the marker was the path to eternal life and oneness of the divine. Some argued that this was what it meant by convergence. Some for the movement had been held in check by the guards, but even some of them, Markov realized, had started to become believers. He was in danger of losing control of his project. They needed to find a simple way to harness the power of the marker and do it quickly. He was sure the technology, once harnessed, would be the pathway to tremendous power, even domination of the world, not to mention the moon, even the solar system. But now a group of believer scientists was trying to put down strict rules about how the marker could be examined. Only respectful interaction with the marker should be tolerated. Nothing that might threaten or damage it or cause it to think less of humanity. We need to show the marker that we were worthy of it so that it would begin to teach us. It was a ridiculous list of demands, and Markov dismissed them out of hand, but he couldn't stop people from talking. There was a palpable shift in how people approached the marker, even if Markov had refused the believers' demands. Indeed, he was surprised at how many people in the facility seemed to feel an almost religious awe for the marker. Something was changing, shifting, in a way that didn't respond to his usual tactics. He had to figure out a new way to approach the situation. He put a vid link through to Cracks. From how quickly he answered, it was clear he'd been waiting beside the monitor for the call. "You've had a chance to look over the data," Cracks asked. "Yes," said Markov. "What is your recommendation, Officer Cracks?" An unequivocal refusal to meet any of their demands. "Once we begin to do so, we'll never stop. They're crazy. They shouldn't be tolerated." "It won't end there," said Markov. "Maybe not," said Cracks, "but we have the firepower and they don't." "All right," said Markov. "See to it." 2 days later, Cracks had a call from one of the guards in the marker chamber. "This is the scientist, sir," he said. Cracks could hear a steady rumble of noise in the background. "They're protesting. They won't leave the chamber." "Make them leave," said Cracks. "It's not as easy as that," said the guard. "There are a lot of them. We've had to call for reinforcements. What should we do?" Don't do anything until I get there," said Cracks, "and disconnect." By the time Cracks and his team reached the chamber, things had become more serious. A scientist led by a pudgy man named Field had encircled the marker. They had locked arms and were attempting to keep the guards at a distance. The guards had their weapons out. Many of them were visibly upset. "What is it?" Cracks asked one of them. "What happened?" "You'll have to ask that one," he said, and gestured at Field. "All right," said Cracks. He removed his plasma pistol from its holster and walked forward to the line to where the man was. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked. "We sent you our demands," said Field. "We read them and rejected them," said Cracks. "We're here to protect the marker until you agree to them." "Starting an insurrection, are you? This will surely end poorly for you." A few of the men in the line rustled and looked at one another, though fewer than Cracks hoped. Field looked a little nervous, but his voice was still steady when he spoke. "We're trying to do what's right," he said. "What's right," said Cracks, "is for you and your friends to go back to your quarters." "You'll respect our demands then," said Field. Cracks levelly met his eye. "You shouldn't be interfering in something you don't understand," he said. "I'll ask you again to break your line and go." Field gulped and then shook his head. "Honestly," thought Cracks, "to look at the guy, you wouldn't think he had it in him. But belief makes people unpredictable." "I'll ask once more," said Cracks. "After that, I'm done asking." Field had started to sweat. His eyes seemed strangely glazed, but still determined. He tinted his lips into a white line and shook his head. Cracks smiled, raising the pistol slightly. He shot Field in the foot. He went down in a heap, screaming, and the room broke into chaos. A plasma beam fired by one of the believers cut close across his cheek, singing his hair, and struck a guard just behind him, full in the face. He went down bleeding, blinded. Cracks crouched, shot another scientist in the leg. Shots flew back and forth on both sides, and then Cracks had an idea. He fired directly at the marker, watched the blue fire splat on the surface, and flickered about before going out. He darted forward to Field and knelt beside him where he lay grimacing in pain. He forced Field's head around to look at the marker and then fired at it again. "No," said Field, clearly terrified. "You'll hurt it. Don't." "Tell them to stop," shouted Cracks. "Tell them to put down their weapons and surrender, or I'll have every guard in here shooting the thing." And to show he meant business, he fired at the marker a third time. Suddenly he was overwhelmed with pain, his head feeling as though it were ready to explode. He gasped for breath. People all around him were doing the same. Field screamed and then began to yell for the believers to listen to him, to stop the violence, to put their weapons down. At first the believers were too distracted by pain, and gradually they gathered themselves and stood as if stunned. Cracks bellowed and raised his own palm to stop his guards from resuming fire. God, his head hurt. For the good of the marker, we must concede the battle," said Field. "Lay down your weapons, brothers. Do not resist." Cracks was amazed when he found that to a man they did. Just more proof, he thought, that religion is a dead end. The next 20 minutes were spent imprisoning the believers and attending to the wounded. There were 4 dead, 2 guards, and 2 scientists. He ordered them dragging off to the morgue. Cracks smiled. He hadn't had so much fun since the moon skirmishes. It had been a very satisfying day. If only his head didn't hurt so much, it would have been downright perfect. It started again. Chapter 49. It started again, said Altman. "The pulse. I'm sure of it." He was clutching his head when he said it, clearly in pain. Ada, too, was rubbing her forehead, though absently, not suffering as much. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said. "Then I'll see her again. My mother will come back." Altman turned away frustrated. They were in the land compound, which had become, as they immediately found out, more like a detainment center than a research facility. Their labs were empty, containing only the most basic equipment. There was only one way out of the center, and that was guarded day and night by a rotation of the 3 men who had originally correlated him for Markov before he had come to the floating compound. All had names that started with T. Terry was then thin with glasses, but he carried a large caliber gun. The other 2, Tim and Tom, were brothers, large men who looked enough alike to be twins. On the first day, Altman had tried to go outside and he was stopped. "But I just wanted to," he started to say. "Nobody's in or out," said the bespectacled Terry. "That's the rule until the boss says otherwise." When he tried later with either Tim or Tom on duty, he met a less verbal refusal, was simply pushed back, and then, when he persisted, punched in the stomach. "Go away," Tim and Tom said. There were maybe 20 of them in the compound, including nearly all the scientists from Chicxulub, except for Field and, for some reason, Showalter. They tried to continue the research they had been doing on the floating compound, but without proper equipment it was impossible. Instead, they compared notes, shared information, and research. Like Ada, many of them had become believers. Many of them had been part of Field's flock and looked up to Altman, recognizing him as a reluctant prophet. "A marker has chosen me," an entomologist named Agassiz confided in him. I don't know why, but I know it to be the case. Why are you telling me this? I know you speak it too, said Agassiz. Asked it about me. Others were like that as well, approaching him, hoping for a sign or a blessing. At first he tried to tell them that it wasn't possible, that he wasn't a prophet, but it was difficult enough to convince them that he found a few cryptic words or a muttered blessing was quicker and would get them to leave him alone. Speaking with Agassiz, he realized that it would be simple matter to manipulate them. He could tell Agassiz that he had a role and that his role was to obey Altman. There were enough believers that he could use their belief to get them to help him break out. But he hesitated. If they were to try to leave now, they might manage to overpower whichever of the 3 guards was on duty, but probably not before a few of them were hurt or killed. The last thing he wanted was more death on his conscience. Despite the lack of equipment, Scud somehow managed to create a limited set of research equipment, partly by stripping out the wires of the security system, including something to provide a crude measurement of the pulse. He was able to confirm that, yes, in fact, the pulse was up and functioning strongly. I cannot say exactly how strongly, he said. There is a limitation of equipment. Yes, said Altman, but within the limitation you can confirm that it seems strong. There was a limitation of equipment, Scud insisted, but as it turned out, Altman didn't need Scud to tell him. He could tell by the way the people around him changed, becoming either withdrawn or violent, and by the fact that he kept turning the corner and running into ghosts. Help us, they pleaded, make us whole. He brooded, wondered what he could do. He had to go public, but how? He couldn't escape. And then suddenly, late one night, walking down the hall, he realized that the guard on duty at the front door, Tim and Tom, was talking to himself. He watched him gesture to empty air and then hold out his rifle and let go of it. It clattered to the ground, and he just left it there and then went rapidly down the hall, passing Altman without a second glance. Nobody was guarding the door. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his wallet, his hollow pod, and Ada's hand and immediately rushed to escape. Sure enough, there was still no one there. The key left in the lock. With shaking fingers, he turned it and opened the door. What if it's a trap? He couldn't help but think, maybe it is a trap, but it might also be my only chance. He crossed the threshold and ran, dragging Ada reluctantly behind him. He was already formulating his next steps, a car or bus out of town, then a flight back to the North American sector. He'd have to move quickly, but if he did, he might get word out it was time to go public.